I stood frozen in the center of a five-star Manhattan ballroom, watching my father shrink under the gazes of 400 wealthy strangers. They sneered at his 20-year-old suit, whispering jokes about lost truck drivers and farmers, while my husband just told me to relax. I let my bouquet hit the marble floor, the silence deafening. They thought they were mocking a poor old man, never suspecting he was secretly worth over $1 billion. My name is Lilith DeLeon. I am 30 years old, a logistics manager for a mid-sized e-commerce firm in Cleveland, where I spend my days organizing chaotic supply chains into straight, efficient lines. But standing here in the center of a five-star hotel ballroom in Manhattan, I realized that no amount of organizational skill could fix the disaster unfolding before my eyes. This was not my world. This was the world of the Montgomerys, an empire built on infrastructure investment and real estate, a world where money was not spoken about because it was simply the oxygen they breathed. The air in the room smelled of expensive orchids and old money. Over 400 guests filled the cavernous hall, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns that cost more than my father made in a year. There were CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, high-powered attorneys whose names were on the sides of buildings, and Wall Street investors who moved markets with a text message. They were all here for the groom, for the Montgomery legacy. I was just the accessory, the girl from the Rust Belt who had somehow snagged the golden boy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with wedding day jitters and everything to do with isolation. I scanned the crowd, desperate for a singular anchor in this ocean of strangers. I needed to see him. I needed to see the one person who actually loved me, not for the image I projected, but for who I was. Then I saw him. My father, Samuel Quinn, was standing near the emergency exit, as if he were ready to bolt the moment someone asked him for his ticket. He was 62 years old, but under the harsh crystal chandeliers, he looked older. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal gray number he had bought for a funeral 20 years ago. The fabric was slightly shiny from wear at the elbows, and the cut was boxy, completely out of fashion amidst the sleek Italian tailoring surrounding him. His leather shoes, polished within an inch of their life, were still undeniably worn down at the heels. He was holding a glass of sparkling water with both hands, looking around with a wide, innocent wonder. When he caught my eye, he straightened up and offered me that soft, crinkling smile of his. It was a smile that said he was proud, that he was happy just to witness my moment. But the room did not see what I saw. A group of 3 women, draped in silk and dripping with diamonds, were standing near a towering ice sculpture. They were not looking at the bride. They were looking at Samuel. One of them, a woman with hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, leaned in to whisper to her friends. However, in a room designed for acoustics, her whisper carried like a stage direction. "Who on earth is that?" she asked, her lip curling. "He looks like a truck driver who got lost looking for the service entrance." The woman next to her giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. "I do not know. Do you think security is actually checking the guest list? Or do they just let anyone in off the street if they are wearing a tie?" The sound of their tittering laughter was like ice water down my back. I felt a flush of heat rise from my neck to my cheeks, a mixture of burning shame and a sharp, defensive anger. I wanted to abandon the receiving line. I wanted to run across the polished floor, grab my father's calloused hand, and pull him into the family VIP section where he belonged. I wanted to shield him. But I was frozen. The weight of 400 pairs of eyes felt like physical hands holding me in place. I was the bride. I was on display. Every movement I made was being analyzed, and I was terrified that if I made a scene, I would only draw more fire upon him. "Lilith, darling." The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with arsenic. I turned to see my mother-in-law, Vivian Montgomery. She was wearing a silver gown that probably cost more than my father's house. She floated up to me, placing a cold hand on my bare shoulder. Her smile was perfect for the cameras, but her eyes were devoid of warmth as she followed my gaze toward the exit door. "Your family is certainly very distinct," Vivian said. The pause she took before the word distinct did more damage than a slap. So rustic. I do hope he is comfortable here. It must be quite overwhelming for him. We would not want him to feel out of place, would we? Her friends, a circle of sharks in satin, laughed politely. It was a sound that said, "We know he does not belong, and we know you know it too." I looked at Ethan, my fiancé, my husband in a matter of hours. He was standing right next to me, looking dashing in his bespoke tuxedo, swirling a glass of scotch. He had heard his mother. He had heard the women by the ice sculpture. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "They are making fun of my dad. We need to go get him. He should be standing here with us." Ethan sighed, a short exhale of impatience. He leaned in close, smiling for the benefit of the onlookers, but his tone was clipped. "Lilith, please, do not make this a big deal. They are just joking around. It is harmless. Today is about us, okay? Do not cause a commotion over nothing." Nothing. He called my father's humiliation nothing. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second, the handsome face I had loved for 8 years seemed to blur. He was not looking at Samuel. He was checking his watch, ensuring the timeline of his perfect day was proceeding according to the spreadsheet. Behind us, a burst of raucous laughter erupted. I turned to see Sloane, Ethan's younger sister. She was 24, an influencer of some sort, always viewing the world through the lens of her smartphone. She was holding her phone up, recording a video. The lens was pointed directly at my father. She was laughing as she typed something onto the screen. She turned the phone around to show her cluster of friends. "Check this out," Sloane said, her voice carrying over the low hum of jazz music. I captioned it. "Father of the bride straight from the farm crashes high society. This is going to get so many views." Her friends shrieked with delight. "Oh my God, Sloane, you are terrible," one of them cried, though she was clearly hitting the like button on her own screen. "Look at his shoes," another one pointed out. "Does he even know where he is?" My stomach twisted into a hard knot. I felt sick. My father was standing there, oblivious to the fact that he was being turned into a digital punchline by my new family. He was just watching me, his eyes shining with tears of joy. The coordinator signaled that it was time for the formal family photographs. This was it, the moment I could bring him up. "I want my father up here," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Now." I waved to Samuel. He saw the gesture and hesitated. He looked down at his shoes, then patted his jacket pocket as if checking for a reassuring object, and slowly began to walk toward the raised platform. His gait was a bit stiff from years of manual labor, not the easy, gliding walk of the wealthy people around him. As he approached the stage, the atmosphere shifted. The Montgomery family, who had been clustered tightly around Ethan and me, suddenly took a step back. It was a small movement, but it created a physical gap, a demilitarized zone between their designer fabrics and my father's polyester blend. Vivian adjusted her diamond necklace, looking anywhere but at Samuel. Richard Montgomery, my father-in-law, checked his cufflinks with an air of immense boredom. Samuel stepped onto the platform. He looked small. He looked terrified. But he looked at me and smiled, reaching out a hand to touch my arm. "You look beautiful, sweetie," he whispered. Before I could respond, Sloane, who was standing near the band's setup, leaned toward one of the microphones that had been left active for the toasts. She clearly thought she was being witty, just whispering a joke to her friends, but the acoustics of the room were unforgiving. "And now for the special segment," Sloane's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The farmer walks onto Wall Street." The feedback whine was short, but the laughter that followed was long. It rippled through the hall. 400 people. Not all of them laughed, but enough of them did. It was a wave of amusement at the expense of a man who had never hurt a soul in his life. I saw the smile freeze on my father's face. It did not disappear. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, it cracked. His eyes, which had been bright with pride, suddenly turned red and watery. He pulled his hand back from my arm as if he had burned me. He hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself smaller, trying to occupy less space in a world that had just told him he was unwanted. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw an apology. He was apologizing to me for embarrassing me. He was apologizing for existing in his cheap suit and worn shoes. Something inside my chest snapped. It was not a metaphorical break. I felt it physically, like a dry twig stepping under a heavy boot. The love I had held for Ethan, the respect I had forced myself to have for his family, the desperate desire to fit into this shiny, cold world, it all shattered. I looked at Ethan. He was chuckling awkwardly, looking down at the floor, waiting for the moment to pass. He was not stepping forward. He was not grabbing the microphone to defend the man who had raised his future wife. He was complicit. I looked at Vivian, who was smirking behind her champagne flute. I looked at my father, the man who had worked double shifts to buy me textbooks, the man who had eaten toast for dinner so I could have meat, the man who was currently wishing the floor would swallow him whole because of these monsters. My hands went slack. The heavy bouquet of white roses and orchids, which had cost $300, slipped from my fingers. It hit the marble floor with a wet, heavy thud. Thump! The sound was not loud, but in the break between laughter, it was percussive, it was final. The room went quiet, the laughter died down, replaced by a confused murmur. People sensed that this was not part of the script. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the electricity of a coming storm. I did not look at the guests. I did not look at the photographer who was frantically trying to adjust his lens. I looked straight at my father. Then I turned my gaze slowly, deliberately, to Ethan. The silence stretched out, thin and taut. I took a breath. It was the first full breath I had taken all day. I could feel the words forming in my throat, acid and fire, ready to burn everything to the ground. I was no longer the nervous bride from Cleveland. I was a daughter who had seen enough. I opened my mouth, and I prepared to say the sentence that would destroy the Montgomery reputation and end this wedding before the first course was served, before the bouquet hit the floor, before the laughter of the Manhattan elite tore through my father's dignity. There was a time when I believed the divide between Ethan and me was a bridge we could build, not a wall designed to keep me out. My mind reeled back 8 years to a damp, gray evening at a university in Pittsburgh. It was the sort of night that soaked into your bones, the kind of cold you only truly understand if you have spent your life trying to save on heating bills. I was 22, a scholarship student surviving on caffeine and sheer desperation, working the graveyard shift at a logistics warehouse on the edge of campus to cover my rent. I remember the sound of the crate hitting the concrete. It was heavy, filled with textbooks, and my grip had slipped because my hands were numb from the unheated loading dock. The box burst open, spilling books into a puddle of dirty rainwater. Panic flared in my chest. That damage would come out of my paycheck, and I had exactly $40 to my name for the rest of the month. That was when I saw the silver sports car idling nearby, a machine that cost more than my father's house and his garage combined. The door opened, and I expected a sneer. I expected some rich kid from the business school to laugh at the clumsy girl in the oversized uniform. Instead, Ethan Montgomery stepped out. He did not look at his Italian leather shoes or his cashmere coat. He knelt right down in the slush, his knees pressing into the grime, and started gathering the books. "I am so sorry," he had said, flashing a grin that was disarmingly crooked, entirely at odds with the perfection of his jawline. "Let me help you with that. These things are heavier than they look." He did not act like the prince of the business department. He acted like a decent human being. That night, as he helped me restack the pallet, wiping grease off his hands with a silk handkerchief, he then tossed carelessly into a bin. I thought I had found a unicorn, a rich boy who did not care about being rich. We fell into a rhythm that felt deceptively like equality. We spent nights huddled in the library, sharing greasy pizzas that cost $2 a slice, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid. I told him about Youngstown, about the grit of the steel town that raised me. I told him about my mother dying when I was young, leaving a hole in the universe that Samuel Quinn had tried to fill with double shifts at the garage and clumsy, burnt birthday cakes. Ethan listened, or at least, I thought he did. He seemed fascinated by the rawness of my life. In return, he spun me a tale of a golden cage. He told me how much he despised the galas, the charity balls that were just tax write-offs in disguise, and the endless pressure to be a Montgomery. I promise you, Lilith, he had whispered one night in my narrow dorm room bed, tracing the line of my jaw. That world is just a shell. It is suffocating. I am going to make my own way. I am going to choose my own life, and I choose you. I believed him. God help me. I believed him. The first crack in the illusion should have been obvious the first time he took me to New York. We were 6 months in, and he wanted me to see the penthouse on the Upper East Side. The elevator opened directly into the foyer. I stepped out onto marble that was polished to a mirror shine, my sneakers squeaking in the hush of the apartment. There were paintings on the walls that I had studied in my art history electives. Originals, not prints. A climate-controlled wine cellar hummed softly in the distance, holding bottles older than the United States. The furniture looked like it had been curated for a museum, not for living. I felt small. I felt dirty, like I had tracked the soot of Youngstown onto their pristine white rugs. Ethan had squeezed my hand. "Do not let it scare you," he said, kissing my temple. "This is just the backdrop. It is not who I am." But then came dinner. Richard Montgomery sat at the head of a mahogany table that was long enough to land a plane on. He did not eat. He dined. He cut his steak with surgical precision. His eyes fixed on me like I was a fluctuating stock graph he was trying to analyze. "So, Lilith," Richard said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "Ethan tells me you are from Ohio, a working-class background." "Yes," so I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "My father is a mechanic." Richard nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed a suspicion. "And tell me, honestly, what do you think you can bring to my son's life? Beyond, of course, a cute story of overcoming adversity? Everyone loves a survivor story, but it does not exactly pay the dividends, does it?" The question hung in the air, brutal and naked. Vivian, sitting to my right, let out a soft, tinkling laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Oh, Richard, do not be so harsh." She turned to me, her smile tight. "He just means that it is quite a leap. Dear, you have so much grit. It is very admirable. You are like a little flower growing through the pavement, so resilient." She spoke of me not as a person, but as a project, a charity case, a stray dog that Ethan had brought home, one that might be amusing for a while but would eventually need to be put back outside. I looked to Ethan for defense. I waited for him to slam his hand on the table, to tell his father that I brought love, intelligence, and loyalty. Instead, Ethan laughed nervously. "Dad, come on. Lilith is great. She is really smart. She manages the logistics schedules better than the professors." He pivoted to my utility. He justified my presence by how useful I was, not by who I was. Later that week, back in Pittsburgh, my best friend Naomi sat me down. She was studying sociology, and she saw the world with a clarity that frightened me. "Lilith, you are walking into a lion's den wearing a steak vest," Naomi had said, her face serious. "You think this is a fairy tale? These people do not marry outside their tax bracket unless they need new blood to strengthen the line. You are entering a world where people like us always have to prove we are worthy, every single day. Can you handle that? Can you handle knowing that to them, you will always be the mechanic's daughter?" I brushed her off. I told her she was being cynical. I told her she did not know Ethan's heart. I told her love was enough to bridge the gap between the penthouse and the garage. I was so desperate to prove that my poverty was not a character flaw that I missed the darkness lurking beneath their wealth. There was one night, about a year before the wedding, Ethan had come back to our apartment drunk. He had been at a networking event with his father, forced to rub shoulders with politicians and lobbyists. He stumbled through the door, loosening his tie, smelling of expensive scotch and fear. "I hate them," he slurred, collapsing onto the sofa. "I hate the way they talk about people, like they are numbers." I sat beside him, running my fingers through his hair. "Who?" "My dad. His partners," he muttered, his eyes closing. "They were laughing about the old days, about how they built the empire. There was this factory, years ago, some safety scandal." My ears pricked up. "What do you mean?" Ethan waved a hand dismissively. "Some accident. Dad said it was cheaper to pay the settlements than to fix the ventilation. Can you believe that? Cheaper to let people die." He laughed about it. "Lilith, he said it was just the cost of doing business. Unclean business." A chill went down my spine. I thought of my father, who obsessed over every brake pad and every tire he fixed because he was terrified of someone getting hurt on his watch. "Which factory?" I asked, pressing him. "Ethan, what factory was it?" Ethan's eyes snapped open, and for a second, clarity returned to his gaze. He realized he had said too much. The shutter came down. "It does not matter," he said, pushing himself up and stumbling toward the bedroom. "It was a long time ago, before I was born. Just forget I said anything. It is just the whiskey talking." He never mentioned it again, and when I tried to bring it up, he would get angry, accusing me of trying to dig up dirt on his family, asking if I was looking for a reason to leave him, so I let it go. I buried that red flag under layers of wedding planning and the naive hope that Ethan was the victim of his family's legacy, not the heir to it. I stood by him for 8 years. I signed the prenuptial agreement that stripped me of everything. I endured Vivian's passive-aggressive comments about my fashion choices. I swallowed Richard's lectures on economics that were really just lectures on why poor people deserve to be poor. I did it all because I remembered the boy who knelt in the slush to help me pick up books. I convinced myself that boy was the real Ethan, and the man standing silently while his sister mocked my father was just a temporary glitch. But standing in that ballroom, watching my father shrink into himself, I finally realized the truth. The boy in the slush had been a tourist. He had visited my world for a while, enjoyed the novelty of the struggle, but he had never truly left the penthouse. Naomi was right. I had spent 8 years trying to prove I was worthy of them. But as the echo of the dropped bouquet faded, I realized I had been asking the wrong question. It was not about whether I was worthy of them. It was whether they were worthy of the man in the cheap suit standing by the exit door. And the answer, ringing clear as a bell in the silence of the ballroom, was a resounding no. The engagement ring on my finger was a 3-carat diamond, a heavy, sparkling promise of a future I thought I wanted. But 3 months before the wedding, I learned that in the world of the Montgomerys, promises were not made with diamonds. They were made with ink, lawyers, and cold, hard clauses. The summons to Richard's office in Midtown was not a request. It was a directive. I arrived wearing my best business casual attire, trying to look like the professional logistics manager I was, rather than the interloper they suspected me to be. The office was a glass box in the sky, offering a panoramic view of the city that Richard owned a significant piece of. Richard did not stand up when I entered. He gestured to a leather chair opposite his massive desk. Next to him sat a lawyer who looked like he had been carved out of granite, silent and imposing. Richard slid a document across the polished mahogany. It was thick, bound in a heavy blue cover. "We call this a standard procedure, Lilith," Richard said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It is just a formality to protect the family assets. I am sure a pragmatic girl like you understands." I opened the folder. It was not a few pages. It was a novel. I began to read, and with every page I turned, the air in the room seemed to get thinner. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was crystal clear. It was a complete and total renunciation of rights. If we divorced, I would receive 0 alimony. I would have no claim to any property acquired during the marriage. I would have no access to any Montgomery family trusts. But the clause that made my blood run cold was about potential children. Any offspring resulting from the union shall bear the Montgomery surname exclusively. In the event of separation, primary residence and educational decisions shall remain the sole purview of the Montgomery family estate, to ensure continuity of lifestyle. I looked up, my hands trembling slightly. This says that if things do not work out, I basically have no say in how my own children are raised. Richard, this is extreme. Richard steepled his fingers. It is necessary. We are protecting a legacy. Lilith, we cannot have future heirs being bounced around between unstable environments. Unstable environments. He meant my world. He meant a world where people worked for a living. The door opened, and Vivian breezed in. She was wearing a cream-colored suit, looking every inch the benevolent matriarch. She saw the stricken look on my face and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Oh, darling, do not look so terrified," she cooed. "It is just paper. Think about it this way. If you truly love Ethan, and if you are not here for the money, then none of this matters, does it? If you are not planning to leave, then the exit clause is irrelevant." She smiled, a sweet, poisonous expression that trapped me. If I refused to sign, I was admitting that I cared about the money. If I refused, I was a gold digger. They had cornered me. It was a test of loyalty, designed to strip me of my dignity before I even walked down the aisle. I thought of Ethan. I thought of his promise to build a life separate from them. I convinced myself that this document was just a hurdle to clear so we could get to that life. "I am not marrying him for his money," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Then prove it," Richard said, holding out a gold pen. I signed away my future security to prove a point to people who would never respect me anyway. I told myself that love was stronger than legal text. I was a fool. 2 weeks later, Samuel came to New York. It was the first time my father had traveled east since the 80s. He took the bus because he said the train was too expensive, a 12-hour journey that must have wreaked havoc on his back, though he never complained. I picked him up at the chaotic Port Authority terminal. He was carrying a duffel bag and a square cardboard box tied with twine. "I made an apple pie," he said, beaming as he hugged me. "From the trees in the backyard. I know they have fancy food, but nothing beats homemade, right?" My heart swelled with a painful mix of love and protective fear. I wanted to tell him that the Montgomerys probably had a pastry chef on retainer who made pies that looked like architectural marvels, but I just hugged him back and said, "It is perfect, Dad." I brought him to the penthouse for the Meet the Parents dinner. I had prepped him on what to wear, slacks and a button-down shirt, and he looked neat, clean, and terrifyingly normal against the backdrop of the Montgomerys' museum-like home. We sat down to dinner. The table was set with silverware that was heavier than the tools in my dad's garage. Richard started the interrogation before the appetizers were even cleared. "So, Samuel," Richard said, swirling his red wine, "Lilith tells us you run a garage in Youngstown. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Dad said, sitting up straight. "Quinn's Auto Repair. Been running it for 30 years. "Fascinating," Richard drawled. "I suppose in a small town like that, the cost of living is quite manageable. You probably do not have to worry about the market volatility the way we do here. Must be a simple life. No stocks, no bonds, just fixing things." The insult was wrapped in silk, but it was there. He was calling my father simple. He was implying that his world was small and insignificant. Dad placed his fork down gently. He looked Richard in the eye, his expression calm. "It is honest work," Dad said. "I sleep well at night, and I am proud of what I have built. I raised a daughter on my own, sent her to college, and she graduated without a single cent of student debt. That is my portfolio, Mr. Montgomery." I felt a surge of pride so strong it almost brought tears to my eyes. My father had sacrificed everything to make sure I started my life at zero. Not in the negative. Vivian chimed in then, tilting her head. "Oh, that is just so cute, really. It is like one of those heartwarming stories you see on the morning news. The little mechanic who could." She looked around the table at Ethan and Sloane, inviting them to share in the amusement. "Cute," I repeated internally. She had reduced my father's life of blood, sweat, and sacrifice to a cute anecdote. Ethan cleared his throat. Pass the salt, please." That was it. That was his contribution. He did not defend Samuel. He just wanted to move past the awkwardness. The rest of the dinner was a blur of Sloane asking Samuel if he had ever seen a Broadway show, and then acting shocked when he said no, and Richard making subtle jabs about the Rust Belt economy. Through it all, Samuel remained polite. He ate the tiny portions of food, complimented the chef, and thanked them for hosting him. He was a gentleman in a room full of savages wearing designer suits. That night, I drove Dad to the modest hotel I had booked for him in Queens. He had refused to let me pay for a room in Manhattan. We sat in the car for a moment, the engine idling. I watched the neon sign of the motel flickering in the reflection of the windshield. "I am sorry about them," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "They are just intense. It is a culture shock. They do not mean to be rude. They just live in a bubble." Dad turned to look at me. The streetlights cast deep shadows on his weathered face. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "Lilith," he said softly, "are you sure about this family? And I do not mean Ethan. I mean, are you sure you are being respected here? Not just accepted, not just tolerated, respected." "Of course," I lied. "It takes time. Dad, you just have to understand their way." "I understand more than you think, sweetie," he said. He reached over and patted my hand. His palm was rough, calloused from decades of turning wrenches. "Listen to me. There is a difference between being rich and having money, and there is a difference between people who are solid and people who are hollow." He looked out the window, his gaze distant. "There is the kind of rich that is real," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "And there is the kind that is just a shell, a shiny paint job over a rusted engine. You need to learn to distinguish between the two, Lilith, because when the crash comes, the shell crumbles. Only the solid survive." I laughed it off. "Dad, stop being philosophical. They are billionaires. I think they are pretty solid." "Maybe," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Just keep your eyes open. Do not let the shine blind you." He got out of the car, grabbing his duffel bag. I watched him walk into the motel lobby, a lonely figure in a gray jacket. I drove home that night feeling annoyed at my father for not getting it, for being too sensitive. I told myself he was just intimidated by their wealth. I did not know then that Samuel Quinn was not intimidated. He was disappointed. And I certainly did not know that his comment about real wealth was not a metaphor. It was a hint I was too blind to see. One that would haunt me as I stood on that stage in my wedding dress, watching the shell finally crack open. The smooth, liquid notes of a saxophone floated through the air. A sophisticated jazz standard meant to signal the beginning of the formal introductions. To everyone else, it probably sounded like celebration. To me, it sounded like a funeral dirge playing underwater. My ears were ringing. A high-pitched whine that drowned out the clinking of crystal glasses and the polite murmur of 400 wealthy guests. I was back in the moment, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and malice. To my left, Sloane was still holding court with her circle of friends. She had not stopped recording. She was editing the video of my father in real time, her thumbs flying across the screen. She turned the phone to a girl in a backless gold dress. "Look at the caption," Sloane whispered, though she made no effort to actually lower her voice. I wrote, "Hope he knows how to use a fork and does not try to eat the soup with his hands." The girl in the gold dress threw her head back and laughed, a sharp, braying sound. "Oh my God, Sloane, you are awful. Do you think he knows what a finger bowl is? He might try to drink it." "I give it 10 minutes before he asks for a beer," another guy chimed in, swirling his scotch. "Or tries to fix the air conditioning." Every syllable was a physical blow. My chest felt constricted, as if my corset had suddenly been tightened by invisible hands. Vivian stepped in front of me to adjust the white rose pinned to Ethan's lapel. She smoothed the fabric of his tuxedo with obsessive precision, her back turned to my father. "Smile, Ethan," she murmured, barely moving her lips. "The photographer is circling, and do not worry about the Scenery over there. Most of these people are here for the Montgomery name. In a week, nobody will even remember who the bride's side was." She patted his chest and stepped back, her face rearranging itself into a mask of maternal joy. I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine. His palm was damp. He looked at me, seeing the tremor running through my body. For a split second, I saw panic in his eyes. Not panic for my father, but panic that I might ruin the aesthetic of his perfect day. "Lilith," he hissed, leaning in close so our foreheads almost touched. It looked intimate to the crowd, a groom comforting his emotional bride. "I am begging you, do not make a scene. They are just blowing off steam. It is just a joke." "A joke?" I whispered back, my voice shaking. "They are humiliating him. Ethan, that is your father-in-law." "We will apologize to him later," Ethan said, the words rushing out. "I promise, once the reception is over, we will buy him a nice gift. We will smooth it over. Just get through the speeches. Please, do not embarrass me. Do not embarrass me." That was it. That was the sum total of his love. It was conditional on my ability to remain silent while his family tore mine apart. The master of ceremonies, a man with a voice like melted butter, stepped up to the main microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the father of the bride, Mr. Samuel Quinn." The applause was sparse, polite but thin. Somewhere near the back, a wolf whistle cut through the air, followed by a jeering catcall. "Careful up there," a man's voice called out from a table of investment bankers. "Hope the stage does not have any grease on it." A ripple of laughter went through the room. My father began to walk up the 3 steps to the stage. He stumbled slightly on the second step, his worn shoe catching on the plush carpet. The laughter grew louder. It was not a warm chuckle. It was the sound of a crowd watching a bear dance. Samuel rights himself. He stood next to me, blinking under the harsh stage lights. He looked so small. He tried to smile at the crowd, a wobbly, uncertain expression. He reached for his pocket, likely to pull out the speech he had been practicing for weeks, written on index cards with his shaky handwriting. He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He was trying so hard to be dignified for my sake. He was taking every arrow they shot at him and absorbing it so I could have my fairy tale. Suddenly, Sloane moved. She did not walk. She sauntered. She grabbed the secondary microphone from the stand near the band, the one meant for the singers. She tapped it twice. Thump, thump, drawing every eye in the room. "Attention, everyone," Sloane said, her voice amplified and bright with cruelty. "Before we get to the boring speeches, I just wanted to welcome everyone to a very special episode of reality TV." She gestured dramatically toward my father. "Welcome to the Farm Meets Wall Street," she shouted. "Let us see if the rustic charm survives the appetizers." The room exploded. It was a roar of laughter, a tidal wave of mockery. 400 people, the elite of New York, united in the hilarity of a working-class man daring to stand on their stage. I looked at my father. The smile finally fell off his face. His lower lip trembled. A single tear escaped his eye and tracked through the deep lines of his weather-beaten cheek. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Something inside me, the last tether holding me to this life, snapped. It was violent and absolute. The vision of the penthouse, the future children with the Montgomery name, the charity galas, it all incinerated in the heat of my rage. My hands went numb. I looked at the bouquet of white orchids in my hands, the symbol of my new life. I opened my fingers. Thud. The bouquet hit the floor. The sound was amplified by the sudden gasp of the people in the front row. The heavy thud echoed against the marble. Silence rippled outward from the stage, silencing the laughter row by row until the cavernous hall was deadly quiet. I did not look at Ethan. I did not look at Vivian. I walked over to Sloane. She looked at me, a smirk still playing on her lips, thinking I was coming to join the joke. I reached out and ripped the microphone from her hand. The feedback screech was piercing, making half the room flinch, I did not care. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone until my knuckles turned white. I turned to face the crowd. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. But when I spoke, my voice was terrifyingly steady. It was the voice of a logistics manager who had just realized the entire shipment was toxic. "There will be no wedding," I said. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "I repeat," I said, my voice rising, gaining strength with every syllable. "There is no wedding. Go home." Ethan stepped forward, his face draining of color. "Lilith, what are you doing? Put the mic down. You are hysterical." I turned on him, pointing the microphone like a weapon. "I am not hysterical. Ethan, I am finally seeing clearly." I looked back at the crowd, scanning the faces of the CEOs and the socialites who had spent the last hour treating my father like a circus animal. "I spent 8 years trying to be good enough for this room," I said, my voice booming off the walls. "I changed how I dressed. I changed how I spoke. I signed your contracts. I swallowed your insults." I walked over to my father and put my arm around his shoulders. He was shaking, but I held him tight. "But I will be damned," I shouted. "If I tie my life to a family that thinks it is acceptable to humiliate a good man just for sport, you look at my father and you see a joke because his suit is old and his hands are rough. I look at him and I see the only person in this entire room who knows what the word honor actually means." I looked straight at Richard, who was purple with rage, half rising from his chair. "You people are not superior," I spat. "You are just expensive, and I am done paying the price." I dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a deafening crash that signaled the end of everything. For a second, there was absolute stillness. Then, chaos erupted. "Cut the sound! Cut the sound!" Vivian screamed, her composure shattered, clawing at a sound technician who looked terrified. Richard roared, slamming his fist onto the table, sending wine glasses shattering. "You ungrateful little— Security! Get them out!" Ethan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. He looked at me, then at his parents, paralyzed by his own cowardice. "You will regret this!" a woman from the groom's side shrieked, standing up and pointing a diamond-encrusted finger at me. "You are walking away from a fortune. You will regret this for the rest of your miserable life." I grabbed my father's hand. His grip was strong, familiar, the only real thing in a world of plastic. I turned to look at the woman, then at Ethan, and finally, I looked at my dad. "No," I said, loud enough to be heard over the rising din. "I would only regret it if I stayed silent today." I kicked the hem of my $3,000 dress out of the way. "Come on, Dad, let us get out of here." We turned our backs on the altar, on the Montgomerys, and on the billion-dollar lie, and we began the long walk down the aisle toward the exit signs. The interior of my 10-year-old sedan smelled of stale coffee and the distinct, dusty scent of the heating vents, a stark contrast to the lavender-infused air of the hotel ballroom. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned the color of bone. In the rearview mirror, the glittering skyline of Manhattan was shrinking, reducing the city that had just chewed me up and spat me out into nothing more than a cluster of distant, uncaring lights. My wedding dress, a garment that had cost more than the car I was driving, was crumpled in the back seat like a dead swan. I had ripped the veil off in the parking garage and thrown it into a trash can next to a puddle of oil. My mascara was running in dark, jagged rivers down my cheeks, but I did not wipe it away. I felt like I deserved the stain. Beside me, Samuel sat in the passenger seat. He had taken off his jacket and folded it neatly on his lap. He was staring out the window at the endless stream of red taillights on the Jersey Turnpike, his face unreadable in the intermittent flash of passing headlights. He had not said a word since we walked out of the hotel. His silence was heavier than any scream. I reached out and turned on the radio. Desperate for any noise to fill the vacuum between us, I spun the dial, landing on a financial news station. "And in market news," the anchor's voice droned, "Montgomery Capital closed down 2% today amid rumors of internal restructuring. though analysts say Richard Montgomery is poised for another record quarter. The name hit me like a physical slap. I slammed my hand against the power button, plunging the car back into silence. The vibration of the tires on the asphalt hummed through the chassis, a monotonous drone that seemed to mock me. I could not take it anymore. The dam broke. "I am so sorry. Dad," I choked out, the tears blinding me for a second before I swiped them away. "I am so sorry. I dragged you there. I made you put on that suit. I put you in a room with those vultures." I took a shuddering breath, my chest heaving. "I thought I was doing the right thing," I sobbed. "I was so stupid. I thought if they just met you, if they just saw how good you are, the money would not matter. I thought love could balance out the hate. I took you to a theater, Dad, a fake, plastic theater, and I let them throw tomatoes at you." Samuel turned his head slowly. In the dim light of the dashboard, his eyes were soft. He reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder, giving it a squeeze that felt like an anchor in a storm. "Lilith, breathe," he said, his voice calm and steady, completely at odds with the chaos in my mind. "You did not drag me anywhere I was not willing to go, and you did not let them do anything. You stopped them. You walked away." "But they laughed at you," I whispered, the shame burning my throat. "They treated you like you were nothing." "Let them laugh," Samuel said, looking back out at the dark road. "That wedding was not a marriage. Lilith, it was a merger. It was a trap covered with a white tablecloth. I am just glad you saw the trap before the steel jaws snapped shut on your leg. That is all that matters to me." We drove the rest of the way in a silence that felt less like tension and more like exhaustion. It took us 6 hours to get back to Youngstown. By the time we pulled into the gravel driveway of the small wooden house I had grown up in, the sky was beginning to turn the color of a bruised plum. The house looked exactly as it always did. The peeling white paint, the porch that sagged slightly to the left, the overgrown rose bushes my mother had planted 30 years ago. It was small. It was humble. But as I stepped out of the car and smelled the wet earth and coal dust of Ohio, I felt my lungs expand for the first time in days. We went inside. The air was cold, the house having been empty for 2 days. Samuel immediately went to the wood stove and began to build a fire. His movements practiced and efficient. I sat on the lumpy plaid sofa, still wearing my white corset top and jeans, shivering slightly. "I will make tea," Dad said, disappearing into the kitchen. I heard the familiar whistle of the kettle, the clinking of ceramic mugs. It was the soundtrack of my childhood. He returned with 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea and set them on the coffee table. Then he did something he had never done before. "Sit up, Lilith," he said. His voice had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by a tone of command I had never heard from him. It was authoritative, serious. "Drink your tea. We need to have a conversation, a real one." I sat up, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Dad, what is it? Are you okay? Did the stress trigger your heart?" "My heart is fine," Samuel said. He stood by the fireplace, the flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "But there is something I have kept from you. For a very long time, I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself I wanted you to build your own character without a crutch. But after tonight, after seeing you stand up to Richard Montgomery, I think you are ready." He walked over to his bedroom. I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floorboards. A moment later, he returned carrying a small, heavy steel safe that I had always assumed contained nothing more than my birth certificate and the deed to the house. He set it on the coffee table. He spun the dial, left, right, left, and the heavy door clicked open. He reached in and pulled out a thick stack of documents. They were not old letters or photographs. They were manila folders with logos I recognized from my finance classes, but never expected to see in this house. Vanguard, Fidelity, Berkshire Hathaway. "What is this?" I asked, frowning. "Read the bottom line," Samuel said, sliding a quarterly statement toward me. I picked it up. It was a portfolio summary dated last month. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, expecting to see a retirement fund of maybe $50,000, the result of a lifetime of saving mechanics' wages. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The number had commas, too many commas. Total portfolio value, $1,240,600,000 and change. My brain short-circuited. I looked at the name on the account. The Samuel Quinn Revocable Trust. Is this a typo? I stammered, looking up at him. Is this some kind of scam? Dad, did someone mail this to you to trick you? Samuel sat down in the armchair opposite me. He took a sip of his tea, looking incredibly calm for a man who had just handed me a piece of paper that weighed more than the entire neighborhood. It is not a scam, Lilith, he said, and I am not senile. That is real. That is us. But how? I asked, my voice rising to a squeak. You fix cars. We clip coupons. We kept the heat at 60 degrees in the winter to save money. Dad, you drive a truck with 200,000 miles on it. I fix cars because I like fixing cars, Samuel said simply. And we lived that way because I never wanted you to become one of them. I never wanted you to be soft. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You know your mother died in the explosion at the chemical plant, he began. You know it was an accident. Yes, I said. A valve failure? It was not a valve failure, Samuel said, his voice hardening. It was negligence. Your mother was a safety engineer. Lilith. She wrote 3 reports warning management that the pressure systems were unstable. She told them it was a ticking bomb. They ignored her because shutting down the line for repairs would have cost them 2 days of production. I stared at him, the horror of the story mingling with the shock of the money. When she died, Samuel continued, the company tried to settle quietly. They wanted it to go away. But because your mother had documented everything, and because I had copies of her reports, their lawyers knew they were looking at a massive lawsuit that would expose criminal negligence. They offered a settlement, a very, very large settlement, tens of millions of dollars back then. And you took it? I whispered. I took it, Samuel said. But I swore on her grave that I would never spend a dime of that blood money on luxury. I would not buy a mansion with the money that killed my wife. So I invested it, all of it. I put it into companies that were boring, companies that made things, companies that had clean safety records. I compounded it for 30 years. I read reports every night while you were asleep. I played the long game. My head was spinning. The poor old man, who had been mocked for his cheap suit, was a financial titan who could have bought the hotel we were just in. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, tears welling up again. Dad, when I was working 2 jobs in college, when I was eating ramen, you had $1 billion in a safe? If I had told you, Samuel said gently, you would have leaned on it. You would have lost your drive. You would have become someone who asks, do you know who my father is? Instead of someone who says, this is who I am, and looking at the woman who walked out of that ballroom tonight, I know I made the right choice. I looked down at the statement again. The numbers swam before my eyes. There is one more thing, Samuel said. His voice dropped an octave, becoming dark and cold. The twist. What twist? When I started investigating where to put the money, Samuel said, I also investigated the company that owned the factory where your mother died. I wanted to know who made the decision to ignore her reports, who decided that 2 days of profit was worth more than her life. He pulled another document from the safe. It was an old, yellowed annual report from an investment firm. He opened it to a page listing the board of directors and the major shareholders of the parent company that owned the factory. He pointed to a name halfway down the list. The factory was part of a portfolio managed by a private equity group, Samuel said. The lead partner on that account, the man who personally signed off on the budget cuts that denied the safety repairs, was a young, ambitious executive named Richard Montgomery. The air left the room. Richard? I gasped. Ethan's father? The same, Samuel said. He built his first major success on the profits from that factory, The foundation of the Montgomery Empire is poured over the accident that killed your mother. I felt sick, physically, violently sick. I had almost married the son of the man who was responsible for my mother's death. I had signed a contract to give my children his name. You knew, I whispered. At the dinner, when he asked you about the cost of living, you knew. I knew, Samuel said. I have followed his career for 30 years. I know every company he has bought, every corner he has cut. I know exactly how hollow he is. Why didn't you stop me, I asked. Why did you let me get engaged? Because you loved him, Samuel said, and I hoped, I prayed, that the son was different from the father. I wanted to give you the chance to be happy, but I also kept my eyes open. I was waiting to see if they would break you, and tonight, they tried. He closed the safe door with a heavy click. They think they crushed us tonight, Samuel said, a cold fire burning in his eyes. They think we are just roadkill they left in Manhattan, but they have no idea what is coming. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the billionaire investor, the man of steel will who had hidden in plain sight for decades. You are the logistics manager, Lilith, he said. You know how to move things. You know how supply chains work. I have the capital. We are not going to sue them. We are not going to argue with them. He pushed the stack of financial statements toward me. We are going to buy them. The fire in the wood stove popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, the only sound in the room besides the settling of the old house. I sat there, the weight of the financial statements heavy in my lap, looking at my father. For 30 years. I thought I knew everything about him. I knew how he took his coffee, black, 2 sugars. I knew he hummed old country songs when he was working on a transmission. I knew he grieved my mother with a quiet, constant ache. But I did not know this. Samuel leaned back in his armchair, his hands clasped together, looking not at the money, but at a framed photograph on the mantel. It was a picture of my mother, Laura, laughing while holding a wrench, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. You remember her laugh? Samuel asked softly. It was the only thing loud about her. In everything else, she was precise, careful. She was a safety engineer. Lilith, that was not just a job title to her. It was a religion. She believed that if you followed the rules, if you respected the physics and the chemistry, everyone got to go home to their families at 5 o'clock. I nodded, my throat tight. I remember she used to check the tires on my tricycle. She did. He smiled sadly. She was working at the chemical plant in West Virginia then. It was a big operation. High pressure, high risk, and your mother, being who she was, started noticing things. Sensors that were calibrated wrong, ventilation systems that were clogged, pipes that were corroded 3 years past their replacement date. He took a deep breath, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. She wrote reports, one after another. I have them all in a box in the attic. She warned the site manager. She warned the regional director. She told them that the pressure buildup in Sector 4 was reaching critical levels. She used the word catastrophic in 3 separate memos. He looked at me, his eyes hard. They told her she was being hysterical. They told her that shutting down Sector 4 for maintenance would cost the company $2 million a day, and that was not in the quarterly budget. They gambled with physics to save a line on a spreadsheet. I knew the end of this story, but hearing the mechanics of it, the cold calculation behind the tragedy, made my blood turn to ice. The explosion happened on a Tuesday, Samuel said, his voice devoid of tremor but heavy with pain. 11 people died instantly. Your mother was one of them. She was in the control room, trying to manually override the pressure valves because the automatic system failed, just like she said it would. He paused, staring into the fire. The investigation was brutal. The company tried to blame operator error, but because Laura was meticulous, because she had kept copies of every email and every report in a safe deposit box, we had the smoking gun. We had proof that they knew. The settlement they offered was not just an apology, it was hush money. It was a panic payment to keep the executives out of prison. And that is where the money came from, I whispered. $32 million, Samuel said. That was the initial payout. A check written to silence a grieving husband and a motherless child. He looked at me with an intensity that pinned me to the sofa. Lilith, when I held that check in my hand, I felt like my hands were burning. That was not a lottery win. That was your mother's life. It was her blood. I could not spend it. I could not buy a sports car or a mansion with the money that killed the love of my life. It felt obscene. So you hid it, I said. I repurposed it, he corrected. I made a vow. I swore that I would take that money, that symbol of corporate greed and negligence, and I would use it to prove them wrong. I invested only in companies that had perfect safety records, companies that treated their workers like human beings, not spare parts. I wanted to prove that you could be decent and still be rich. I wanted to build a clean empire out of their dirty money. But why the secrecy? I asked, gesturing around the humble living room. Why did we live like this? Dad, I wore hand-me-down coats. I worked double shifts at the warehouse. You let me take out loans for books. That, Samuel said, leaning forward, was the hardest decision I ever made. He looked at my hands, rough from years of handling cardboard boxes and pallets. I looked at the children of the wealthy people involved in that lawsuit, he said. I saw how they grew up. They were soft. They were entitled. They thought the world owed them a living just because of their last name. They had no grit, no spine, and I was terrified. Lilith, I was terrified that if you knew we had millions, you would lose your fire. Memories flashed through my mind. I remembered being 16, begging him for a used Honda Civic so I would not have to take the bus to school. All the other kids had cars. I had cried, telling him he was being unfair. He had sat me down and told me that if I wanted a car, I could work at the garage on weekends and earn it. I remembered the school trip to Europe during my junior year. Everyone went. It cost $3,000. I pleaded with him. He told me it was not a necessity, and we had to prioritize the mortgage. I stayed home while my friends posted pictures from Paris. I hated you for that, I confessed, my voice shaking. The Europe trip, I thought you were just being mean. I thought we were broke. I cried myself to sleep the night the plane took off without you, Samuel admitted, his eyes glistening. I could have written a check for the entire plane. Lilith, I could have bought the hotel they stayed in, but I knew that if I gave you everything, you would appreciate nothing. You wanted me to struggle, I said. It was not an accusation anymore. It was a realization. I wanted you to build yourself, he said firmly. I wanted you to know the value of $1. I wanted you to understand what it feels like to be invisible, to be the person serving the food, not just the one eating it, because character is not built in comfort. Lilith, it is forged in the fire, just like steel. He reached out and took the financial statement from my lap, closing the folder. There were so many times I almost broke, he said softly. When you were tired, when you were stressed about tuition, and especially when you met Ethan, I saw how his family looked at you. I saw that look in Vivian's eyes, like you were something she stepped in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw a bank statement in her face and buy the chair she was sitting on. But you didn't, I said. No, Samuel said, because if I had stepped in with my money, they would have accepted you, but they would have accepted you for the checkbook, not for the woman you are, and you. You might have gotten comfortable. You might have started thinking that their approval mattered. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the dark driveway where my old car sat cooling in the night air. I needed to know who you were when the chips were down, he said. I needed to know if you would stand up for dignity when it cost you everything. If you had known about the money, walking away from Ethan would have been easy. You would have had $1 billion safety net. It takes no courage to leave a king when you have your own castle. He turned back to me, and his face was glowing with pride. But you did not know, he said. You thought you were walking away into poverty. You thought you were losing your entire future. And you did it anyway. You stood in front of 400 powerful people and told them to go to hell because they disrespected your father. You chose honor over comfort. You chose truth over power. I felt the tears finally spill over, hot and fast. I realized then that every denied request, every shift at the warehouse, every moment of making do had been a lesson. He hadn't been depriving me. He had been arming me. He had built me into a weapon capable of taking down the very system that had killed my mother. I didn't want you to be a person who walks into a room and says, "Do you know who my father is?" Samuel said, his voice cracking with emotion. I wanted you to be the woman who walks in and says, "This is who I am. And tonight, God, Lilith, tonight you were 10 feet tall." He walked back to the coffee table and placed his hand on the stack of papers. "I am tired. Lilith," he said quietly, "I have been fighting this war in the shadows for 30 years. I have been moving pieces on the board, waiting for the right moment. But I am an old mechanic. I know how to fix things, but I do not know how to break them." He pushed the papers toward me. "You are a logistics manager," he said. "You know how to dismantle systems. You know how to find the weak link in the chain. You know where the bodies are buried because you have been digging in the dirt with the rest of us." "What are you saying?" I asked, looking at the portfolio that represented the life and death of my mother. "I am saying it is time," Samuel said. "You passed the test. You have the character. Now, you have the capital. I am giving full control of the Quinn Strategic Holdings to you." He looked me in the eye, a general handing his sword to his lieutenant. "You know what Richard Montgomery did. You know his family. You know their vanity, their greed, and their weaknesses. And now, you have the power to make them answer for it." I looked down at the papers. The numbers no longer looked like lottery winnings. They looked like ammunition. "If we do this," I said, my voice steadying, "we do it my way. We don't just hurt them. We expose them. We make sure that what happened to Mom never happens to anyone else on their payroll." "That," Samuel said, a grim smile touching his lips, "is exactly what your mother would have wanted." I reached out and placed my hand over his on the documents. The heat from the fire was warm on my face, but inside, I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. The crying was over. The grieving was done. "Okay, Dad," I said. "Show me everything. Let's get to work." I did not want to burn them down. Fire is too messy, and it burns out too quickly. What I wanted was illumination. I wanted to turn the lights on so bright that every cockroach in the Montgomery Empire would have nowhere left to scurry. "I do not need them to be destitute, Dad," I said, staring at the financial breakdown of Montgomery Capital that was spread across our kitchen table. "Poverty is too easy a punishment. It is just a lack of money. I want something worse for them. I want exposure. I want the whole world to see that their gold is just painted rust." Samuel nodded, setting down a mug of coffee. "Then we do not attack the stock price. Not yet. We attack the structure." We started the next morning. We did not go to Manhattan. We did not hire a high-rise office. We turned the small, drafty guest bedroom of our Youngstown home into a war room. We bought 3 high-powered servers, encrypted everything, and established a Delaware-based shell company called Quinn Strategic Holdings. It sounded boring. It sounded like 100 other nameless, faceless investment firms that clogged the arteries of the American financial system. That was the point. "We need to move quietly," Samuel instructed, his fingers flying across a keyboard with a dexterity that belied his age. "The moment we hit 5% ownership, we have to file a public disclosure with the SEC. We need to acquire as much as possible through indirect channels before we cross that line. We need to be the shark swimming beneath the boat." We began buying. We did not buy in massive blocks that would spike the price. We bought in fragments, 1,000 shares here, 5,000 there. We used a network of smaller LLCs, all legally distinct, but ultimately funneling back to Quinn Strategic, to pick up equity whenever the market dipped. It was slow work, like assembling a bomb one wire at a time. While Samuel managed the acquisition, I managed the investigation. This was where I realized that my 8 years in logistics were not wasted. Logistics is not just about moving boxes. It is about seeing the flow of a company. It is about understanding that if a dollar goes in at point A, it has to appear at point B, and if it disappears in the middle, someone is stealing it. I pulled the public financial records of Montgomery Capital's subsidiaries. They were a mess of cross-holdings and vague consulting agreements. To an average investor, it looked like complex diversification. To me, it looked like a shell game. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a line item for a subsidiary called Mont Logistics based in New Jersey. They are paying 20% above market rate for warehousing in Newark. I know the rates in Newark. I negotiated contracts there last month. Nobody pays this much unless they are renting the Taj Mahal to store plywood. I dug deeper. I looked at their shipping manifests. They were billing for expedited freight on routes that had no time-sensitive cargo. They were paying consulting fees to companies that had no websites, no employees, and addresses that turned out to be mailboxes in strip malls. "It is a siphon," I told Dad. "They are inflating operating costs to pull cash out of the public company and move it into private hands." To prove it, we needed more than just suspicion. We needed witnesses. We hired a team of forensic accountants and corporate investigators from Chicago. We met them in a nondescript diner halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. We made them sign non-disclosure agreements that were so tight they could barely breathe. And we paid them double their usual rate to ensure their loyalty lay with the checkbook, not the reputation of the Montgomerys. "I do not care about the stock price," I told the lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen. "I want you to follow the expenses, find the personal spending buried in the corporate accounts, find the ghosts." While Karen's team followed the money, I went hunting for the bodies. I spent nights scouring LinkedIn and industry forums, looking for former employees of Montgomery Capital. I was not looking for the retirees. I was looking for the people who had left abruptly, the ones who had resigned for personal reasons or been let go due to restructuring. I found a man named David, a former internal auditor who had been fired 2 years ago. I reached out to him, claiming to be a researcher doing a piece on corporate governance. He agreed to talk only via an encrypted messaging app. "You are wasting your time," David wrote. "They are bulletproof. Richard has friends in the regulator's office." "Nobody is bulletproof if the caliber of the round is big enough," I typed back. "I am not looking for gossip. David, I am looking for the reason you were fired." There was a long pause. Then, a file appeared in the chat. "I saved this before they locked me out of the server," he wrote. "It is an email chain from Richard to the CFO. I opened the file. The date was from 3 years ago. The subject line was innocuous: Project Alpha Budget Adjustment. But the content made my stomach churn. Richard was instructing the CFO to reclassify the costs of a site inspection in the Mediterranean. The inspection involved a 2-week charter of a mega yacht. The cost was $400,000. He told the CFO to bury it under client acquisition costs. But it got worse. Further down the chain, there was a discussion about a monthly stipend of $15,000 being paid to a consulting firm owned by a woman named Veronica. I did a quick background check. Veronica was 23 years old, a former model, with zero experience in infrastructure or finance. Richard was using the company as his personal piggy bank. He was stealing from his own shareholders to fund his vacations and his mistress. "It is classic embezzlement," Samuel said when I showed him the documents. "But it is not enough to kill him. He will pay a fine. He will settle. We need something that strikes at the heart of the business." I went back to the data. I went back to the invoices. And then I found it. I was looking at the maintenance logs for a bridge project in Pennsylvania that Montgomery Capital managed. The engineering team had requested a budget of $3 million for seismic retrofitting. Richard had denied it. I found the memo. It was short, brutal, and terrifyingly familiar. Risk assessment shows probability of failure is within acceptable tolerance. Richard had written, "Defer maintenance to Q4 of next fiscal year. Prioritize dividend payout." Acceptable tolerance. The phrase rang in my ears. It was the same logic. It was the exact same cold calculus that had killed my mother. They were gambling with human lives to keep the profit margins high enough to pay for their yachts. "He has not changed," I whispered, the rage vibrating in my voice. "He is doing the exact same thing. Dad, he is cutting safety to feed his greed." Samuel looked at the memo, and his face went hard as stone. Then we do not just expose him for theft. We expose him for endangerment. We make him radioactive. We mapped out the endgame. We are currently at 3.8% ownership, Samuel said, pointing to the whiteboard where we tracked our progress. We need to get to 4.9%. We stay just under the reporting limit. Then, we execute a series of block trades all at once to jump to 12%. That gives us the legal standing to call for an emergency general meeting. And at that meeting, I said, picking up the thread, we do not ask for a board seat. We ask for a full, independent forensic audit of the last 10 years of operations. Exactly, Samuel said. Richard will refuse. He has to refuse. If he opens the books, he goes to jail. But if he refuses a major shareholder's demand for transparency after we leak these emails to the press, the stock will tank. The other shareholders will panic. They will sue him. And we will be there to pick up the pieces, I said. It was a beautiful, lethal plan. It used the market's own mechanisms against him. We were not breaking the law. We were enforcing it with extreme prejudice. We spent the next 2 weeks in a blur of caffeine and strategy. We coordinated with the lawyers. We drafted the press releases that we would send anonymously to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. We prepared the dossiers for the SEC. It was late on a Tuesday night. The wind was howling outside the wooden walls of our house. The only light in the room came from the glow of 3 computer monitors. On the center screen was a complex organizational chart of the Montgomery Empire. It was a tangled web of holding companies, offshore accounts, and subsidiaries. It looked impenetrable. It looked powerful. But I knew where the cracks were. I picked up a red marker. I walked over to the printout of the chart taped to the wall. I drew a thick red circle around the box at the very top labeled Montgomery Capital Board of Directors. Then, I drew a line connecting it to a small, handwritten box at the bottom labeled Quinn Strategic Holdings. My handwriting was sharp and jagged. I looked at the diagram. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like the mechanic's daughter. I did not feel like the scholarship student or the charity case. I felt like the CEO I was about to become. I uncapped the marker again and wrote a single sentence next to the red circle. The day they have to listen to me. We are ready, I said to Samuel, capping the marker with a definitive click. Samuel looked at the chart, then at me. He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that had been 30 years in the making. Then let us go shopping, he said. I think it is time we bought ourselves a company. The silence that had enveloped the Montgomery Empire for decades was not broken by a shout. It was broken by the hum of a fax machine and the ping of a high-priority email arriving in the inbox of the company's general counsel on a rainy Tuesday morning. We had moved quietly, through a web of proxy solicitors and careful negotiations with disgruntled minority shareholders. Quinn Strategic Holdings had amassed a voting block of 28%. We were no longer a nuisance. We were a siege engine parked at their front gate. The letter we sent was drafted by the sharpest legal minds in Chicago, but the message was simple. As a major shareholder, we were exercising our right to demand a forensic audit of executive spending over the last 5 years. We cited grave concerns regarding fiduciary irresponsibility. At first, they laughed. My source inside the administration building, a secretary who had been overlooked for a raise 3 years in a row, told me that Richard threw the letter onto his mahogany conference table and called it a shakedown. He told the board members that we were just some hedge fund looking for a quick payout, trying to spook them into buying our shares back at a premium. Ignore them, Richard had reportedly said. Let them sue. We will bury them in paperwork for a decade. He did not know that we were not interested in a payout. We were interested in the truth, and we did not need to wait for a lawsuit to get it. We just needed to light a match. 3 days after their refusal, the leak sprang. It started with a small article in a niche financial blog, detailing a peculiar discrepancy in Montgomery Capital's travel budget. But within hours, it had been picked up by the major networks. The documents we had anonymized and released were damning. They showed a pattern of spending that would make a Roman emperor blush, all categorized as legitimate business expenses. I sat in our living room in Youngstown, watching the television as a reporter stood outside the stock exchange. "Breaking news regarding Montgomery Capital," the reporter said, pressing an earpiece against the wind. "Leaked documents appear to show that CEO Richard Montgomery used company funds to finance a $400,000 charter of a superyacht in the Mediterranean last summer. The expense was listed in the books as off-site leadership training, yet flight logs suggest the only passengers were Mr. Montgomery and a 23-year-old fashion model." The screen cut to a graphic showing the company's stock ticker. It was a steep, jagged red line plunging downward. "Furthermore," the reporter continued, "allegations are surfacing regarding a slush fund disguised as a consulting retainer for a firm that has no employees and operates out of a residential mailbox in the Cayman Islands." It was a bloodbath. The market hates uncertainty, but it hates theft even more. The stock opened at $84 a share. By lunch, it was trading at $62. By the closing bell, it was hovering around $50. Panic set in. Pension funds, which are legally required to minimize risk, began to dump the stock. Institutional investors, the big whales of Wall Street who had golfed with Richard for years, suddenly stopped returning his calls. They saw the smoke, and they were not going to stick around to burn. This was the moment Samuel had been waiting for. "Now," my father said, sitting at his computer with the focus of a sniper. "They are selling out of fear. We are buying out of justice." As the world sold Montgomery Capital, Quinn Strategic Holdings bought. We bought every share that hit the floor. We bought them at $48. We bought them at $45. We swept up the debris of Richard's reputation and locked it into our vault. By the end of the week, our ownership stake had climbed from 28% to nearly 40%. We were no longer just knocking at the gate. We owned the gate. Richard tried to stop the bleeding. He called a press conference on the steps of the Montgomery headquarters in Midtown. I watched it on my laptop. Richard looked haggard. His usually perfect tan looked sallow, and there were beads of sweat on his upper lip that the high-definition cameras picked up mercilessly. "These are baseless attacks," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "This is a hostile takeover attempt by a shadow organization that refuses to show its face. They are fabricating documents. They are trying to destroy an American legacy." A reporter from the Times shouted a question. "Mr. Montgomery, can you explain the $15,000 monthly transfer to Miss Veronica Miller? Is she a consultant for infrastructure projects?" Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. He slammed his hand down on the podium. "I do not have to answer to you," he roared. "I built this city. I will find out who is behind this, and I will sue them into oblivion." He stormed off the stage, shoving a cameraman aside. The image of the dignified billionaire was gone. In its place was a frightened, angry bully. The stock dropped another 4 points before the feed cut out. My phone began to buzz. It was Ethan. For days, he had been silent. Now, the messages were flooding in. "Lilith, please pick up. Dad is losing his mind. I know you are angry about the wedding, but this is crazy. Are you seeing the news?" Then, a darker tone. "Wait, the fund is called Quinn Strategic. Quinn, is this you? Lilith, answer me. Tell me you are not doing this." I read the messages, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I did not reply. I did not block him. I let the read receipt show up on his phone. I wanted him to know that I was seeing his panic and choosing not to alleviate it. My silence was not passive anymore. It was a weapon. The social fallout was just as swift as the financial one. Vivian, who had sneered at my father's suit, found herself uninvited from the Met Gala. The committee sent a polite email stating that, due to the current controversy, her presence would be a distraction. I heard from a friend of a friend that she had thrown a vase at the wall when she read it. But the sweetest justice was reserved for Sloane. The internet is a cruel place, and it has a long memory. Someone had dug up the video Sloane posted of my father at the wedding, the one where she mocked him as a farmer and a lost truck driver. But now, the context had shifted. People were juxtaposing her cruel laughter with the news of her father's embezzlement. The hashtag #FarmersAreNotTrash began to trend on Twitter. Thousands of people, mechanics, nurses, teachers, farmers, were posting pictures of their dirty hands and tagging Sloane. They were calling her a parasite. They were dissecting her fashion, her surgery, her entire existence. I saw a video of Sloane running out of a Starbucks, covering her face with a designer bag as paparazzi shouted questions at her. "Hey, Sloane," one photographer yelled. "Does your dad's stolen money pay for that latte?" She jumped into a waiting SUV and sped away. The girl who lived for likes was being destroyed by them. With the stock price in freefall and the public outcry reaching a fever pitch, the board of directors had no choice. They could not protect Richard anymore. They had to save the company. On Monday morning, Quinn Strategic Holdings received a formal invitation. The board was calling an emergency general meeting at the headquarters. They were inviting the representative of the majority shareholder group to present a stabilization plan. They had no idea who the representative was. They assumed it was some corporate raider from Chicago or a private equity shark from London. The day of the meeting, the sidewalk outside the Montgomery building was a zoo. News vans were double parked for 3 blocks. Reporters were jostling for position, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mystery investor who had brought the giant to its knees. Inside, the atmosphere was funereal. I walked into the building through the service entrance, the same way the cleaning staff entered. Samuel was with me. We were not taken to the main lobby. We were ushered into a small waiting room adjacent to the main boardroom. The air conditioning was humming. Through the thin walls, I could hear the murmur of the gathered shareholders. They were terrified. They were angry. They were guessing names. "It has to be BlackRock," one voice said. "No, I heard it is a foreign sovereign wealth fund," another whispered. I stood in front of a mirror on the wall. I was not wearing a wedding dress. I was wearing a navy blue blazer, tailored and sharp, and a pair of sensible heels. My hair was pulled back in a tight bun. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman who had come to work. Samuel stood beside me. He was wearing a new suit. It was not flashy. It was dark gray, wool, and it fit him perfectly. He looked distinguished. He looked powerful, but he still had the same calloused hands. He reached out and adjusted my collar. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I have been ready for 8 years," I replied. "They are expecting a wolf," Samuel said, a small smile playing on his lips. "They have no idea they are about to get the sheepdog." The door to the boardroom opened. A frantic-looking assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Quinn?" she asked, looking at her clipboard, clearly confused by the name. "The board is ready for you now." I looked at my father. He nodded. We did not hold hands this time. We did not need to comfort each other. We walked side by side, 2 equal partners stepping out of the shadows. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The hum of conversation died instantly. At the head of the table, Richard Montgomery sat with his head in his hands. Vivian was beside him, looking pale and ghostly. Ethan was staring at the table, spinning a pen nervously. I took a step into the room. The sound of my heels on the parquet floor was the only sound in the world. Heads turned, eyes widened. Richard looked up. His jaw dropped. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. "Hello, Richard," I said, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Richard stood at the head of the long mahogany conference table, gripping the lectern as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The room was packed to capacity with shareholders, board members, and legal counsel, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. I watched him from the shadows of the antechamber, listening to the voice that had once terrified me now quiver with impotent rage. "We are under attack," Richard declared, his voice booming through the microphone, though it lacked its usual confident timbre. "There is a shadowy, malicious force out there, an external enemy that seeks to dismantle a legacy built over 40 years. They are spreading lies. They are manufacturing scandals. I ask you, My friends and partners, to stand with me. Do not let these vandals destroy a great American institution." He paused to wipe sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked exhausted. "We will find out who is behind this Quinn Strategic Holdings," Richard vowed, shaking a fist. "And when we do, we will expose them for the vultures they are." The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open. The company's chief legal counsel, a man named Sterling who looked like he was about to faint, stood up. He cleared his throat, tapping his microphone. "Actually, Mr. Montgomery," Sterling said, his voice trembling, "that will not be necessary. The representative for Quinn Strategic Holdings has arrived to address the board personally." The room went deathly silent. Every head turned toward the entrance. They were expecting a shark in a three-piece suit. They were expecting a faceless hedge fund manager from London or Dubai. Instead, they got me. I walked into the room, my heels clicking rhythmically on the parquet floor. I was wearing a simple navy blazer and trousers, my hair pulled back in a severe bun. Beside me walked Samuel, wearing his new charcoal suit, his head held high, his hands clasped behind his back. We walked down the center aisle, past the rows of stunned faces. A murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave. "Wait," a woman in the second row whispered, loud enough to be heard. Is that the bride?" "It is the girl from the video," a man hissed back. "The runaway bride, and that is the father, the truck driver." "What are they doing here?" We reached the front of the room. I stopped 10 feet from where Richard stood. Richard stared at me. His face went chalk white, then flushed a deep, violent crimson. The veins in his neck bulged. "You," he spat, the word dripping with venom. "What the hell is this? This is a closed meeting for shareholders. You have no business being here. Security, get these trespassers out of my building." 2 uniformed guards took a step forward, their hands moving to their belts. "Sit down." "Richard," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. "How dare you!" Richard roared, pointing a shaking finger at my father. "You think because you ruined my son's wedding you can crash my board meeting? Get out. Get back to your garage." "Mr. Montgomery," Sterling, the lawyer, shouted, stepping between Richard and the guards. "Stop! You cannot remove them." "Why not?" Richard screamed. "They are nobody." "They are the majority," Sterling said, dropping the bombshell that sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Quinn Strategic Holdings is the registered owner of 41% of Montgomery Capital stock. They are the single largest voting bloc in this room. They own you, Richard." Richard froze. He looked from Sterling to me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Ethan, sitting to his father's right, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and confusion. I walked past Richard and took the podium he had just vacated. I placed my laptop on the surface and plugged in the HDMI cable. "Good morning," I said, looking out at the sea of faces. "My name is Lilith DeLeon. I am the managing director of Quinn Strategic Holdings." I gestured to Samuel, who stood stoically to my right. "And this is Samuel Quinn, my father, the chairman of the board." I pressed a button, and the screen behind me flickered to life. It showed a pie chart of the company's ownership structure, with a massive blue slice labeled Quinn Strategic. "We are not here to destroy this company," I continued, my tone professional and cold. "We are here to save it. We are here to stop Montgomery Capital from being used as a personal ATM for the executive suite." "This is absurd," Richard sputtered, trying to regain his footing. "That man is a mechanic. He does not have the capital to buy 1% of this firm, let alone 40. This is fraud. They are fronting for someone else." Samuel stepped forward. He did not shout. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick document. He tossed it onto the table in front of the board of directors. It landed with a heavy thud. "That is a certified history of my personal investment portfolio," Samuel said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I have been investing in industrial sectors since 1992. I was an early backer of huge logistics firms and clean energy startups. I did not inherit my money. Mr. Montgomery, I made it. Every single cent. A board member, a gray-haired woman known for her skepticism, picked up the document. She flipped through the pages, her eyebrows rising higher with every turn. She looked up at Samuel, and for the first time, there was no mockery in her eyes. There was only respect. "It appears everything is in order," she said quietly. "Mr. Quinn is indeed a highly liquid and sophisticated investor." The room shifted. The atmosphere changed from confusion to anticipation. The predator had become the prey. "Now," I said, drawing the attention back to the screen, "let us discuss why we are here. Please look at the slide." I clicked the remote. The screen filled with a spreadsheet. Rows of numbers were highlighted in red. "This," I said, using a laser pointer to circle a figure, "is a series of payments totaling $450,000 labeled as client acquisition. However, cross-referencing with flight logs and credit card receipts shows that this money was spent on a private yacht charter in the Greek Isles." I clicked again. A photo of a luxury villa appeared. "This is a property in Aspen," I said, "listed as a corporate retreat, but property records show it is occupied year-round by a distant cousin of Mr. Montgomery, who holds no position in the company." I clicked again. A timeline of monthly transfers appeared. "And these are payments to a shell company controlled by a Miss Veronica Miller," I said, looking briefly at Vivian. She flinched as if I had slapped her. "Totaling nearly $200,000 over 18 months, all charged to shareholder accounts." The room erupted in whispers. Shareholders were looking at Richard with open hostility. He was shrinking in his chair, tugging at his collar. "This is theft," I stated plainly. "But theft is just money. We can recover money. What I am about to show you next is why Richard Montgomery is unfit to lead any organization involving human lives." I clicked the remote one last time. The screen went black. Then a scanned image of an old, yellowed document appeared. It was a safety report from 30 years ago. "My mother was Laura Quinn," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate and intense. "She was a safety engineer at the chemical plant in West Virginia that was part of the early Montgomery portfolio." I saw Richard's eyes widen in recognition. He remembered. "She wrote this report," I said, pointing to the screen. "She warned that the pressure valves in Sector 4 were failing. She warned that an explosion was inevitable. She recommended a shutdown for repairs." I clicked to the next slide. It was a memo signed by Richard Montgomery. "And this," I said, "is the response, denied due to budgetary constraints." The silence in the room was suffocating. "My mother died 3 weeks later," I said, "along with 10 other people. They died because Richard Montgomery decided that their lives were worth less than 2 days of production profit." I turned slowly to face Richard. He was pale, sweating profusely, looking like a trapped animal. "You killed her," I said. "You did not pull the trigger, but you signed the death warrant, and you are doing it again. I found the memos on the Pennsylvania Bridge project. You are cutting the same corners. You are gambling with the same lives." I walked around the podium until I was standing right in front of him. "At my wedding," I said, my voice shaking slightly with suppressed emotion, "you and your family looked at my father and you saw a joke. You laughed at his suit. You laughed at his hands. You called him trash because he worked for a living." I gestured to Samuel, who stood tall and proud, the moral center of the room. "You judged him by his cover," I said, "but while you were buying yachts with stolen money, he was building a fortune with clean hands. He lived simply so he could raise a daughter who would one day stand here and stop you." I looked at the board of directors. "We are calling for an immediate vote of no confidence," I demanded. "Richard Montgomery is to be removed as CEO effective immediately. We demand a full forensic audit and the restitution of all misappropriated funds." "Seconded," the gray-haired woman on the board said instantly. "Thirded," another member said. "All in favor?" the chairwoman asked. Every hand in the room went up. Even Ethan's hand twitched. Though he did not raise it, he just sat there, staring at me, seeing the woman he had dismissed as a project now standing as the executioner of his father's career. "The motion carries," the chairwoman announced. "Richard, please surrender your badge and leave the premises." Richard stood up. He looked small. He looked old. He tried to straighten his jacket, to salvage some scrap of dignity, but it was gone. He looked at me one last time, his eyes full of hate and fear. "You will regret this," he whispered. "I told you once before," I said, meeting his gaze without blinking. "I would only regret it if I stayed silent." Security stepped forward. "This way, Mr. Montgomery." As they led him out, cameras flashing through the glass walls, I looked over at Ethan. He looked like a child who had just realized the monsters were real, and he had been living with one. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe to apologize, maybe to beg, but I turned my back on him. I looked at my father. He gave me a small nod, a look of profound peace on his face. The war was over. We had won. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Richard Montgomery, but the silence I expected did not follow. Instead, the boardroom exploded into chaos. It was the sound of an empire fracturing. Sterling, the general counsel, was shouting into his cell phone, threatening lawsuits against anyone who would listen. 2 junior board members were frantically packing their briefcases, looking as if they expected the FBI to kick down the windows. Outside the glass walls, I could see the lobby filling up with press. They swarmed against the security turnstiles like bees attracted to the scent of spilled sugar. The chairwoman, a formidable woman named Eleanor, who had voted with us, slammed her gavel onto the table. "Order!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the panic. "We need order!" She turned her gaze to me. The room slowly quieted down, the tension shifting from the ousted king to the new queen. "Ms. de Leon," Eleanor said, her face grim, "you have your vote. Richard is gone, but the market is in freefall. The stock is down another 12% in the last hour. If you intend to liquidate this company to settle a personal score, tell us now. We need to know if we are preparing for bankruptcy or a transition." Every eye in the room fixed on me. They were terrified. To them. I was still the wild card, the scorned woman with a nuclear button. They thought I was here to strip the copper out of the walls and leave 20,000 employees on the street just to hurt the man who had hurt me. Before I could answer, a chair scraped against the floor. Ethan stood up. He looked terrible. His tie was loosened. His hair was a mess, and the arrogance that had defined him for the last decade was gone. He looked at the empty chair where his father had sat. Then he looked at me. For the first time in 8 years, he did not look through me. He looked at me. "Lilith," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. I stayed silent, waiting. "I know nothing I say matters anymore," he began, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "I know I failed you. At the wedding, I was a coward. I watched them mock Samuel, and I did nothing because I was too afraid of rocking the boat. I chose the path of least resistance, and I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." He took a breath, looking around the room at the terrified faces of the executives. "But please," Ethan continued, his eyes pleading, "do not take it out on them. There are thousands of people, engineers, secretaries, construction workers, who depend on this company to feed their families. They had nothing to do with what my father did. They had nothing to do with how my family treated yours. Please, Lilith, do not let your hate for us destroy them." The room held its breath. It was the first honorable thing I had ever seen Ethan do. It was too late to save us, but it was enough to save his own soul. Perhaps. I walked back to the podium. I looked at Ethan. Then I scanned the faces of the board members. I thought of the workers in the warehouse where I used to work. I thought of the mechanics in my father's garage. "I am not my father-in-law," I said, my voice steady and calm. I picked up the financial report, the one documenting the theft, the greed, and the negligence. "I did not come here to burn Montgomery Capital to the ground. I announced, I came here to perform surgery. You are afraid I will strip the assets? You are wrong. I know logistics. I know that this company has good bones. It has brilliant engineers and hardworking crews. The problem is not the body. The problem was the head. I turned to the screen, projecting a new slide I had prepared the night before. This is the path forward, I said. Effective immediately. We are instituting a zero-tolerance policy for safety violations. Every project, from the smallest bridge repair to the largest skyscraper, will undergo an independent safety audit. If it fails, we shut it down until it is right. No exceptions, no budget overrides. I pointed to the second bullet point. We are establishing the Laura Quinn Safety Fund. I declared, 5% of all annual net profits will be automatically diverted into a trust dedicated to compensating victims of industrial accidents and funding safety equipment for our frontline workers. We are not going to hide our mistakes anymore. We are going to pay for them, and we are going to prevent them. I looked at Eleanor. I am not a banker. I said, I am a logistics manager. I know how to make things run efficiently. I am offering to step in as interim chairwoman to oversee this transition. My goal is not to loot the treasury. My goal is to prove that a company can be profitable without being predatory. Eleanor let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging in relief. And what about the Montgomery family? She asked, glancing at Ethan. I looked at Ethan. I saw the fear in his eyes, not for his money, but for his identity. I do not need them to be destitute, I said cold. Poverty is a struggle, and quite frankly, they would not survive it. They do not have the skills. I paused, letting the words sink in. I am not going to sue to take their personal homes, provided they return the misappropriated company funds. But here's the price. Richard Montgomery is banned from this building and from any board position for life. The family name will be removed from the signage, and they will live the rest of their lives knowing that the only reason they still have a roof over their heads is because the people they mocked were merciful. I looked Ethan in the eye. I do not need to see you on your knees. Ethan, I just need to never see you in power again. That is my justice. Ethan nodded slowly. He slumped back into his chair, defeated but relieved. The board voted unanimously to accept the transition plan. The meeting was adjourned. As Samuel and I walked out of the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The fear was gone, replaced by a stunned respect. The staff we passed in the hallway, assistants, junior analysts, security guards, stopped and looked at us. They did not look at us like intruders. They looked at us like liberators. We took the elevator down to the lobby. The moment the doors opened, the flashbulbs blinded us. The press had broken through the outer cordon. Reporters were shouting questions, thrusting microphones over the heads of the security team. Ms. De Leon, is it true you have ousted the CEO? Mr. Quinn, are you really a billionaire? What happens to the wedding? I held up a hand. The shouting died down, just a fraction. I stood next to my father. He looked tired, but he stood straight, his hand resting gently on my elbow. We have made a statement to the board, I said, my voice projecting over the noise. Montgomery Capital is under new management. We are returning the company to its core values, integrity, safety, and hard work. That is all we have to say about the business. A reporter from a tabloid pushed to the front. She was young, hungry, and holding a recording device. Lilith, she shouted, what about the people who laughed at your father? What do you have to say to the guests who mocked you at the wedding? Do you hate them? The question hung in the air. I thought about the women by the ice sculpture. I thought of Sloane and her hashtags. I thought of the feeling of the bouquet leaving my hand. I smiled. It was a genuine smile. No, I said, I do not hate them. I want to thank them. The reporter blinked, confused. Thank them? Yes, I said. If they had been kind, if they had hidden their contempt just a little bit better, I might have married into that family. I might have spent the rest of my life trying to fit into a box that was too small for me. I looked at the camera, addressing every person who had ever made someone feel small because of their shoes or their job. Their cruelty was a gift. I said, it woke me up. They showed me exactly where I did not belong, so that today, I could finally stand where I do belong. So, tell them thank you. And tell them to watch the stock price. It is going to go up. I turned away from the cameras. Come on, Dad, I said. We pushed through the glass doors and out onto the sidewalk. The air in Manhattan was cold and smelled of exhaust and rain, but to me, it smelled like freedom. Behind us, a maintenance crew was already putting a tarp over the brass Montgomery Capital sign, preparing to sandblast the name off the stone. A group of construction workers standing near a scaffolding watched us pass. One of them, a man with grease on his face and a hard hat under his arm, nudged his buddy. That is the guy from the video, he whispered, the mechanic. His friend looked at Samuel. He did not laugh. He nodded. Respect, the man said quietly. Samuel heard it. He did not stop, but his stride lengthened, and his chest swelled just a little bit. We reached my old sedan, parked illegally in a loading zone. A ticket was tucked under the wiper blade. Samuel plucked it off and laughed, a rich, deep sound that I had not heard in weeks. I will pay for it, he joked. I got into the driver's seat. Samuel got in the passenger side. We were just two people in a 10-year-old car, surrounded by limousines and black SUVs, but we were the most powerful people on the block. I looked up at the gray sky. Caught between the skyscrapers, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the city air one last time before we headed back to the open spaces of Ohio. Dad, I said, turning the key in the ignition, let us go home. What we needed to do here, I have done it. Samuel smiled, leaning his head back against the frayed headrest. You did good, kid, he said softly. You did good. I put the car in gear and pulled out into traffic, leaving the billion-dollar skyline in my rearview mirror, driving toward a future that finally belonged to us. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Lilith and Samuel's victory brought you as much satisfaction as it brought me writing it. Now, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story from right now? Are you listening while driving, cooking dinner, or maybe relaxing after a long shift? Let me know in the comments below. I love seeing how far our community reaches. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people who need a little bit of justice in their day. Your support means the world to me. See you in the next story.